welcome back, everybody, with another very exciting BFS edition, Bait Finesse System edition of the Mastering Rod Building podcast. I'm so excited to be joined again for this part two in this series by Amir Azzabi, the founder and owner of Bait Finesse Empire, and someone who's been really helpful to me getting into the bait finesse thing. And I have exciting news, Amir, since we spoke last. I just got back as we're recording this. I don't know when this is going to air, but as we're recording this, I just got back from spending the first full week in November on the White and Norfolk Rivers in northern Arkansas,
That's awesome.
dedicated trout BFSing. And I have been going up and fishing these waters since I was 7 years old, which for me means I got 45 years of experience on them and know them very well. Know stretches of those rivers like the back of my hand. Have fished them under all kinds of water conditions and year round. And buddy, I'm coming back with two resounding findings that I'll share with you and our audience. Number one, as expected, it works. And
Good.
number two, the Mukai Bee chatter is some kind of magic.
Oh yeah.
Man,
Yeah.
dude, we had me and my sales director, Aaron Lowe, Aaron, and the Jack Wagon, my marketing guy, Jack Barron. We were having 100 fish days, and literally we fished with two different guides, both of whom I know well, both of whom are outstanding guides. One of whom is really a dedicated fly guide, but is cool with us fly fishing some, BFSing some, doing whatever. And just but both guides were cynical. And if you want to look him up, it's Jeremy Hunt of Flies and Guides. He's one of the best fly guides I fished with anywhere in the country. And he allowed us to BFS with him since we were three in a boat, in addition to catching fish on the fly rod and on some streamers. And then Jim Mead of Bearded Trout Guide Service. He's another guy who is will take you bait, will take you lures, will take you fly, right? And sort of knows the fishery well. And I think they were both like really skeptical, like a chatterbait for trout. Like, I don't know, you can try it. And then it was like lights out.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And
Yeah. That,
it was just shocking. And it worked on sections that had been stocked recently on hatchery fish. We fished it single barbless in the trophy sections and some of the restricted water sections where it's savvy bigger fish that have seen a lot more. It just worked, man. And they were like, man, where can I get some of those? And actually I had such a hard time getting Mukai Bee chatters that I built some small chatterbaits of my own based on one of your guys, Jimmy, and RAR Fishing, RAWR Fishing. I put together some, and those work great. And so it's like, this is not that different than tying flies or marabou jigs and catching
oh
trout
no.
on them,
Yeah.
because we're
Wire
making our
bending
own
is a
plugs. Yeah, it was
yeah.
super cool,
I'm
man.
personally not a wire bender, but I know a lot of guys that are, man. And you can make
I've
all
become
kinds of
one.
cool. You can make all kinds of cool little lures with wire bending and a handful of little, split rings and blades and little things you got to pick up online. But you got
Absolutely.
a wire bender and some wire. You can go to town and make a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah,
That
and it's cheap, right? It's
yeah.
relatively cheap.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the price on those lures really comes in from the labor. That's,
Yeah, right.
it's a time intensive thing, right? And
Yeah,
design, obviously, you spend a
yeah,
lot of time fine tuning and designing and tweaking to really get them where it's at. But you're right, the
right.
materials themselves are cheap if you have a blueprint or a game plan to follow.
Yeah. And
That
they've
particular lure is
go ahead.
it's phenomenal. It's part of the Mukai's wire lure series. They
Right.
have three lures in that particular series. Unfortunately, the bee chatter, due to legal reasons with Z-Man. That's not one we can offer in the US, but I do offer through Bait Finesse Empire. Their other lures are part of that series, where they have the Bee Buzz, which
That
is
little
the
buzz bait. I
smallest
got some. I
smallest
cannot
buzz bait
wait.
you've ever seen in your life, and it
Yeah.
is just as effective as that chatter. And they also have what's called the Bee Spin, which is
Little
a
spinner
spinner
bait.
bait.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
and these
Yeah.
are all wire and lead based lures, right?
Right.
They're a bent wire with a lead ball to give it some weight.
Yeah.
You can run it with or without a trailer. They're what are called area trout lures. So
Yep.
really they're for ultra downsizing, targeting highly pressured stocked trout in
Right.
tournament situations.
Okay. Yeah.
They got these like maybe half acre to 1 acre ponds that are super clear and stocked with giant rainbow trout and intensively stocked. I'm talking like hundreds and hundreds of fish in there.
Oh wow.
But that doesn't mean you're gonna catch them every cast.
Right.
They're
Yeah.
so pressured, and they're tournament fish, and it's a particular style of tournament fishing that's really popular in Japan, and those lures are made for that.
Yeah.
If you're fishing, more wild trout in the big rivers that you are, especially if you're building your own, I'd recommend upsizing your hooks.
Right. Yeah.
Compared to an area fishing, a tournament area fishing where you're in
Yeah.
clear water with no obstacles.
Yep.
Fishing a river, you're going to run across logs, you're going to run
Sure.
across
Yeah.
rocks. And
Yeah.
you
And
want to upsize a little bit.
miraculously, we lost several of the ones I made. I fish one blaze orange Mukai Beach chatter
Mm-hmm.
every day. Got hung on it multiple times, but was able to free it every time because we're in a boat to go upstream, kind of pull or get behind where it's anyway. It was shocking, and I'm so impressed. The bait looks so simple when you look at it, but there's so much engineering into all of these JDM baits and the depth that it swims and the range of.
Yeah, the real trick on that particular one, what makes it better than the small ones I've seen in the US market is the way they do the blade. It's
Yeah,
a
with
it's
the
the
split
thinner
rating in
blade
it, it is a better blade,
and a
and it
sharper
runs deep.
angle.
Yeah, and you
Yep,
can run it deep, even in
yep,
current, but
yep,
it's not that heavy. So I was just, yeah, and a good hook. And anyway, so I hate
yep.
to harp on a bait that we can't get, but it was such
You
an
can
eye
build
opener
them,
for
like
me.
you said, you can
Well,
build them,
right, yeah,
and I'd
and,
recommend anyone who's interested check out Jimmy's videos
yeah,
because
and so
he does a
we'll
lot of lure building, but that particular one is super effective, super effective.
his and who we're referring to, and we'll link all this up, and we alluded to it in the first podcast, but Amir with Bait Finesse Empire works with a couple of, I don't know, would you call them pro staff members or
Yeah,
ambassadors?
yeah. I
um
mean, they're my team, really. I mean,
yeah,
they're involved in decision making and lure testing and helping me find cool stuff and just getting the. They love the sport as much as I do, which is
right.
why I work with them.
And one of them is Jimmy, who's we're referring to, and he runs a channel called RAR Fishing, RAWR. And it's just, he has a wealth of information out there. It's very data driven and objective. He's not just trying to, sell you stuff. He gives good reviews, he gives bad reviews, he sort of shares what he actually finds. It has been really useful content for me personally. And then he also works with Hunter, and is it No Day, or how does he?
Yeah, Hunter Node. He goes by the
Yeah,
Hunter Fisher.
the Hunter Fisher.
That's
Yeah,
his
and he's
YouTube
got a
and
great
social
channel
media
too.
presence.
Yeah, and he's
He's
a
down in
Florida guy.
Florida.
Yeah,
Yeah, so he gets on some cool fish
yeah,
and it's cool to have Jimmy. He's in the Northeast, right? He's in Jersey.
right.
Hunter's down in Florida. I myself am in Arizona. So when we bring stuff in to test and play with, whether it be rods or lures, it's really getting tested for basically every species, every environment across the country, right? I'm out here fishing for mountain trout, in our Arizona streams. I'm fishing for urban bass and
Right,
those guys are targeting species in areas. Jimmy's a big crappie guy, real big on fishing for crappie. And
right.
Hunter down south, he does a lot of saltwater, he does a lot of bass, he does crappie, all
Yeah,
kinds of cool stuff in Florida,
yeah,
obviously.
yeah. So very cool. And then I had two really major learnings that I want to share too. And you know this already, so I'm telling you stuff but it was a really. And this is why I encourage people all the time, like, don't take someone's word for it. Try it yourself. Buy it, try it, use it, see what you experience, see how it is for you. I have been trout fishing with 4 and 2 pound test line on spinning reels since I was 5 or 6 years old. I mean, this is since ultralight spinners came out. Okay. Um, and I have good equipment. It's not cheap. It's custom rods. It's high end reels. It's fresh, good line. It is shocking. And I would say, by virtue of nothing else than how much time I spend on the water, I'm a pretty good caster and a pretty accurate caster. Your ability to go down the bank in a river situation or out of a boat in a still water situation, the accuracy with which you're able to cast these bait casting reels, not spinning reels. And again, so many people ask, why aren't you just using a spinning reel? Why does it have to be it doesn't have to be a casting reel, doesn't have to be a casting rod, but the two things that jumped out at me in this trout fishing environment, and we caught trout from 6 inches long to 26 inches long, and a whole bunch of them over the 20-inch mark. Number one, your ability to cast accurately at real specific targets, picking pockets like you would fly fishing with a streamer or something as we're drifting down the river, is so good with the small BFS casting setup. It's better than the spinning setup. And I don't care how good you are at the spinning rod. I'm just telling you, the ability to thumb it, the style of casting, your
Mhm.
accuracy is just really good, which you told me it would be and is on your articles, and you talk about this. And the other thing is, and this was a weird one to me, the smoothness of these drags and the amount of torque you get with the revolving spool reel at that same drag setting. I was just, it's anybody who's cynical about, look, if you want to fish a spinning rod and a spinning reel, awesome, do it. If that's what it takes to get
Absolutely.
you to try some of these lures, they will work. You will have success. But in this moving water, big fish, light tackle, the ability to move fish with that revolving spool reel, and the smoothness of the drag on these reels that are dedicated BFS reels. Never mind the click, the outgoing click, which makes it feel like a fly reel, and it's just like, I love it.
It's
It's so
fun. It's a
it's so
fun. That's a fun.
everybody in the boat gets to enjoy the fish taking a run because you hear
Yep.
it, right?
Yep.
But yeah, I was just so super impressed. So with all that said, I'm telling Amir a bunch of stuff he already knows. Today, what we want to do a little bit is we've covered a lot of the history and the evolution and the philosophy behind this. And thank you so much for that, Amir. I'm an enthusiast and a newcomer. It's your livelihood, right? And that shows with your passion, your depth of knowledge. Today, what we want to do a little bit, and as I've been posting literally live between a week ago when we recorded the first episode and when we're recording now, I've gotten like 15 or 16 inquiries from people being like,
Okay.
hey, what did you learn? What about the rods? What about the length? What about the handles? What about casting versus spinning? So it's perfect timing. In this one, we want to get a little more technical and talk very specifically about these rods because
Yeah.
they are highly technical, precise pieces of equipment. In many ways, to me, they're almost need to be matched to what you're doing, the same as you'd match a fly rod, like very
Hmm.
very specific to kind of what you're doing. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today. And based on the inquiries I'm getting, I think this is going to resonate really well with our audience. So let's talk about these BFS rods.
Awesome.
Obviously, the bulk of them have come traditionally from Japan, and they still do. And there's still excellent rods available from
Absolutely.
Japan, and they're ahead of the U.S. market in this stuff. And Amir's got all these at Bait Finesse Empire. You can find reviews from him, from Jimmy, from Hunter on all this stuff. But we're starting to see some American manufacturers getting in this
Yeah.
space. I might be privy to the information that we have more American manufacturers rapidly heading to this space. So
Every day.
I think it's going to get better and better. And that's, it was interest by one of these manufacturers and having me help them set up like you did with Dobbins and some others kind of, hey, what do we need to build? How do we set them up? So let's talk about that. And again, any one rod for any one angler and any one situation, Jimmy or Hunter fishing in the surf off the beach, that's different than when you're sneaking down a
Absolutely.
little native trout stream. So knowing that one size doesn't fit all, let's start kind of at a high level. So far, the way that I'm thinking about this is I'm almost, you can do it with just one rod. You can buy one rod, one reel that's general purpose and sort of get into it. You can have a lot of fun, a lot of success. But it seems to me like I'm kind of starting to get into this space, Amir, where if I'm throwing a micro, a BFS topwater, a BFS moving bait, a BFS crankbait or something, there's kind of one action I want. If I'm throwing something more like a BFS jig or a marabou jig or more of I've caught so many fish on these micro kind of Ned, almost for lack of a better description, soft
Hmm.
plastics. I'm kind of wanting a different action for that. Like, talk to me about how you think about if somebody wanted to have a full quiver of kind of BFS rods, like what action kind of categories would you break them into?
All right. So I think we probably should go a little bit higher level picture with this actually
Sure.
first.
Okay.
So I touched on it a little bit last time, right? We started getting into like some rod lengths. That is
Right.
where I think the rod conversation was really starting. And what I think I said at that point, if I remember myself correctly, is like really you want to think about your environment, you want to think about your lures, and then you want to think about your species, right?
Right. Right.
And it would be impossible for me to give a one size fits all
Sure.
formula
Sure.
if we're looking at just bait finesse. Like
Right.
that could at this day and age, right? This is in 2024. That could mean anything from heading to the beach in Mexico to fishing some piers in California, to fishing for tiny trout in a tiny stream, or giant trout in
Right.
your giant Arkansas streams, or
Right.
some serious tournament bass fishing, right?
Right.
And all of those rods are going to be at, forget the aspect that we're talking about bait finesse. All of those rods are as different for bait finesse as they are for any other thing,
Yeah.
right? Like a
Right.
surf guy doesn't use the same rod as a bass guy, and that guy doesn't
Right.
use the same rod as a creek trout guy,
Right.
right? And
Exactly.
bait finesse it's got that same huge range and that same whether range of lengths, range of actions, range of materials, range of handle setups, everything.
Yep.
Everything you see in a big rod, you have an equivalent of it in bait finesse. The only difference is lighter power,
Okay.
right? Like
Excellent.
that's
Great
literally it.
analogy. Yep.
Like it's a lighter power so that you
Right.
can fish lighter line and lighter lures using a BFS reel, a bait finesse reel, right?
Right.
That's the objective. So what I think we should do today is pick up maybe where the conversation about the history of bait finesse left off, and talk about that rod. Talk about the rod when you go to Japan and you say, "Hey, I want a bait finesse rod."
Right.
That means a very specific thing over there. And
Right.
that's a rod really for tournament bass fishing for particular style, particular situations, right? And
Hmm.
I think what we should focus in on today is talking about that formula, right?
Perfect.
And
Let's do it.
why that's so important, and the versatility in that for the serious bass angler, right? That doesn't mean you can't go to your urban pond and catch crappie on this rod. Sure, you
Sure.
can, and you can catch bluegill, and you can probably go to a stock trout pond and catch some trout on it.
Yeah.
It's gonna work, but there's better rods for all those different species and different lures and different, like you could say an ultralight is an ultralight, but it's not, right? An ultralight
Right.
trout is very different than ultralight bass, and an ultralight bass lure is very different than an ultralight bluegill
Right.
lure, right?
Right.
So the rod we're going to talk about today, I think is going to be is generalized enough where you could take it and you can have fun fishing no matter what you want to fish, but it
For
does have a specific purpose, and that purpose is going to be to catch you serious bass using small lures,
right.
um, in a very what I want to call bait finish approach, right?
Sure.
Using the attributes and the aspects of the reel and the rod working together to give you the benefits of what that setup can do over a spinning or a bigger conventional setup.
Right. And I think that's a great place to start because the reality is that rod's going to cover a
A lot.
huge section of the U.S. BFS
Exactly.
market, and especially where
Exactly.
people are going to start. So to be clear, if you go to Bait Finesse Empire, they break it up into bass BFS rods, panfish BFS rods, saltwater light game rods, trout rods, and even travel rods. So you can don't ignore those specific categories, and you can for
And there's a
purposes
lot
of
of
today.
overlap.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. There's a
Yeah.
lot of overlap.
Right. Today, we're trying to help the rod builder who maybe has a customer come to them and say, "Hey, I want to try a BFS rod," or maybe wants to try it themselves. And I would highly recommend you try it because it is fun and effective. But so that makes sense. Let's start there. It's a great
Yeah.
idea.
And one of the questions I've been asked many times over years, especially when the Dobbins first came out, and this was
Mhm.
like when the USA, the general market USA, right? Not the super niche nerdy JDM guys like myself, but the
Like,
general, the
hey,
guys,
like us. Come on.
but the general everyday angler started asking me, well, is this BFS stuff, is it tournament applicable?
Mhm.
Can I use it in bass fishing tournaments? And I think absolutely yes, you can, right? Like I
Yes.
said
Right.
last time we spoke, there's a long history of BFS. It goes all the way back to the 70s into the 90s. It evolved, it changed. There's a lot of old formulas that are not
Yeah.
necessarily followed anymore. There's ways people tried to build those rods and reels that really, like I said, Yukihiro Sawamura in 2007, 8, 9, that range. He really and revolutionized, and it was called in Japan, it was called the Bait Finesse Revolution. He really revolutionized by setting kind of a formula for both the rod and the reel that to this day is still the blueprint, right? Every
Yep.
company does little things different, and it's gotten more technical and more specific even within the bass realm. There's a lot of different kinds of rods, and we'll talk about those a little bit. But he really set that formula, and so that's kind of where I want to talk about. So
Let's go.
let's break down the rods. Like where do you want to start, Bill? Like
Well,
what do we
so
talk about
let's
first?
start with let's start sort of with length. I think, and we can talk about power and action too. Some of that's kind of inherently defined by
Yeah.
the BFS genre, but let's start there with kind of typical average length, power and action in your mind.
Okay. So for a serious bass angler that wants to do bait finesse fishing, right? And it's going to be a downsized approach using Um, I want to let's set a basic lure and line
Sure,
parameters first,
sure.
maybe, right? That's going to
Okay.
give us some room to play within that. So for lures, you're probably looking at for a serious bass tournament situation, right? Where you want to be able to catch these fish, you want to be able to control these fish and get them in, and you want to catch a lot of fish and also big fish. You're probably looking at 1/16 ounce up to 3/8,
Okay.
which is a big range,
Yeah, that is
right?
a big range.
But
Yeah.
but that is really the range of what these rods are capable of. The
Okay.
the, the real deal bait finesse JDM style tournament rods are
Hmm.
do that range and do it very well.
Okay.
You will sometimes see rods rated a little bit less,
Hmm.
and you will see rods rated a little bit more. And a lot of that actually comes down to how you're measuring the lure. And what I mean by that is you can say, hey, I'm throwing a 16th ounce jig. But
Right.
are you?
Are
Like a
you tipping
16th
it?
ounce
Yeah,
jig
exactly. Right.
has a
Yeah.
trailer, has a
Right.
hook, it has a skirt, right? And
Right.
that
Right.
16th ounce jig might be an 8th ounce, it might be 3/16 ounce, whatever, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so sometimes you'll see rods that say 1/32. And generally, within the real bass realm of fishing, what they mean by that is you could throw a paddle tail on a 1/32 jig head or something like
Yep.
that,
Yep.
right? It,
Right.
it doesn't mean you're throwing little trout magnets and stuff like that on a bass rod. It's just not a great time if you try that, honestly.
Right.
And on the upper end, you got rods that say 3/8, you got rods that say half ounce. You're not necessarily going to tie a half-ounce jig and then put a 4-inch trailer on it, because now you're
Right.
talking like 3/4
More
to an
than
ounce
that. Right.
of,
Yeah.
of weight at the end of your line, right?
Yeah.
Realistically, you're probably talking like a 1/4 ounce jig head with a skirt and a 2 to 3 inch trailer, something like
Right.
that, right? Which is going to
Yep.
put you in that 3/8, maybe up to half-ounce, depending on the density of the plastic you're using.
Right.
Okay. So that just gives, I just wanted to throw that out there because that gives you a huge
100%.
range of what lures fit within that, right? We're not talking about the tiniest stuff. We're not talking about rooster trails and trout magnets with this
Right.
particular rod today,
Right.
right? But we're also not talking, a half-ounce finesse jig, which I see jigs marketed as that, and in my mind, it's an oxymoron. But whatever.
Yeah. Right.
So, and now as far as line,
Yeah.
right? We did talk a little bit about line types,
Sure.
what and knots and stuff like that last time we talked about. I will say in the US and probably even globally that outside of Japan, the trend really has been to use braid.
Hmm.
And we talked about the benefits of that.
Yep.
It
Yep.
is easier to manage. You can, if you want, you can fit more line on the spool, though I don't
Right.
really recommend it. Stick with 50 yards.
Yep.
But you have the adaptability of changing out your leaders, different sizes, different materials. You can do a floral leader, you can do a mono leader. They even have sinking braids nowadays. So there is some
Yeah.
benefit. There is some benefit to braid, but it also has some drawbacks. One, you're tying leaders and you got a leader knot to deal with, which comes into play when you're talking about some of the tiny guides they use on these rods, right?
Right.
And then the other thing is, in my opinion, they're gonna have guys that argue with me. You have guys on my own team that argue with me. But in my opinion, braid, I don't know. I don't know if it kills the action or if it over enhances the action of your rod. And what I mean by that is, if you have a fast action rod and you're using braid, all of a sudden it almost feels like an extra fast. It feels like it doesn't have the
Yep.
give you want it to
Yeah.
have, right? And if you're purposefully trying to use a moderate action or a medium fast or whatever, right? Something that's a little bit slower, maybe you're throwing like crankbaits and stuff. That braid doesn't have the give that a lot of times is, in my opinion, what you want your rod to do, which is
Yeah.
bend and pull, and
Right.
the line is part of that equation, which is very
Hmm.
much why this is called the bait finesse system,
Hmm.
right? So I use whatever line you're comfortable with, whether that be braid or mono, but I particularly like nowadays in my bass fishing. I was a braid guy for a long time, but nowadays for my bait finesse bass fishing, I like using fluorocarbon,
Okay.
and I really think these rods are built for fluorocarbon. The real deal JDM ones, anyways, they're really built for fluorocarbon. Keeping in mind how fluorocarbon moves and stretches,
Right.
the action of these rods is tuned to work with that.
Yeah.
And when you look at the tournament bass guys over in Japan that are using these in real tournament situations and winning tournaments, they're generally using fluorocarbon.
Yeah.
And one of the advantages of using a bait finesse reel versus a spinning reel is the ability to use that, I want to say heavier weight, but it's really kind of that mid-weight fluorocarbon, right? Like you can do a 2 or 3 or 4 pound fluorocarbon on a spinning reel, and it's fairly manageable.
Hmm.
When you get into 7, 8, 9 pound, 5 even fluorocarbon, that's when it gets a little stiffer.
Starts to get a little wiry. Yeah.
And a bait finesse reel handles that a lot better than a
Much
spinning,
better. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, and in these tournament situations, a lot of these guys are using 5 to 9, right? And I know those are odd numbers, and
Yeah.
people are
They
like,
are.
"Wait, 5 pound line, 9 pound line," but yes, they
But
absolutely do exist within the JDM
the
market.
JDM
And I
market
like
has them.
using
Yeah.
those. Maybe it's
Yeah.
just a mental thing for me, but I use a
Yeah.
lot of 5 pound. Why do I use 5 pound? Because I feel like 4 is really light, 6 is heavy.
Right. Yeah.
It gives me
Yeah.
that like confidence that I have with
Yeah.
6, but it lets me feel like my presentation is lighter. The
Right.
line is a little bit wispier, maybe,
Right.
where it lets the lure dance a little better
Yeah.
underwater, if that
Yeah.
makes sense,
Yeah.
right?
It totally
I
makes
like
sense.
using 5, I like using 7, but I'll use 6, I'll use 8, I'll use 9. Some of these rods are rated up to about 12. Like
Hmm.
really, that's like where the upper end of these bait finesse tournament rods are going to be.
Okay. Perfect.
So you're looking at probably like 5 to 12, 4 to 12, somewhere in that range. But I think like if you put a 7, a 6, 7, 8 pound on there, you're going to be very comfortable to use a huge range of lures,
Yeah.
and have the confidence to move fish
Yep.
over logs, over rocks, etc. And the abrasion resistance of fluoro
Surprisingly. Yeah. Yeah.
is a big part of that too.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, I mean, listen, use whatever you have access to, use whatever you've got, use whatever you like, right? Like, but I will tell you that, like so many things, for the BFS stuff that's coming out of the JDM market, and this is me coming off week of fishing and trying a bunch of stuff, a lot of these true dedicated BFS lines that come in the 5 pound test, that come in the 7 pound test, that come in the 3 pound test are, anytime you're making a line, it's a combination of properties that yield something that fishes well, right? These lines are heavily optimized for this, right?
Yes.
So maximum abrasion resistance and knot strength with just the right amount of stretch in this size line. So again, I know some people are going to look at these lines and be like, "Oh, those JD lines are expensive. I'm using trilene. I'm gonna use."
You're gonna have a
And
bad
you can catch
time.
fish on them, but I can tell you for that there is some advantage to buying some of these dedicated BFS lines. And I went into that cynical, like, this is marketing. No, actually, some of
And
these Viravas and Siglon and some of these lines that you sell, they really are
yeah.
superior. Whether it's just that you get the same strength and abrasion resistance in a finer diameter
Hmm.
or better knot strength, but don't sleep on that. Again, remember, I think when we're in the middle of the road with any tackle system, you've got a lot of insurance and it's safe. Inherently, BFS is pushing the limits. What's the
Absolutely.
maximum we can do with this light tackle? So I do think 10 or 12% of strength advantage for diameter or abrasion resistance for diameter or not strength for diameter actually comes into play here, right?
And I think honestly, like it's not even necessarily that it's a bait finesse specific line. Yes, there are bait finesse specific lines. Like Jackal has a very good one, right?
Mm-hmm.
But really, what I think it is it's a difference between a cheap quality fluoro and a high quality fluoro.
Right.
And
Yeah.
yeah, strength, diameter, abrasion resistance, those are all part of it. But you know what? There's a lot of cheaper fluoros that have those things, and they do really well with those things. I think the difference for me, what I noticed, the biggest
Mm-hmm.
difference is the manageability, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The keeping it on the spool, the suppleness of the fluorocarbon of a
Mm-hmm.
high-end fluorocarbon versus a cheaper made fluorocarbon
Right.
is drastically different. Maybe that's
Right.
not a big deal if you're using a huge spinning reel or a conventional size bait caster, but when you're using maybe it is, right? But when
Yeah.
you're using a super shallow
It
spool,
matters.
and you
Right.
only have 50 yards of line,
Right.
and all of a sudden you have a knot, a bird's nest 20 yards into that,
You're done.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You're done for the day, right? So
Right.
it's
Yeah.
really about having a line that you can manage and control really well. And for the guys that have tried fluorocarbon on their bait finesse and they're like, dude, I just can't manage it. I can't manage it. It's crazy. It's hard to do. I will say there is a break-in period. Even a high-end
Mm-hmm.
fluorocarbon
Mm-hmm.
has a break-in period, right?
Okay.
The first couple casts, it can be kind of tricky,
A little
right?
wild.
Stretch that
Yeah.
line out. Use those sprays, right? I hate to like sound like a marketing selling you thing, but those
Yeah.
sprays, spray it the night before, tie it off, stretch it,
Yeah.
make a couple easy casts, let it get
Yep.
wet. Let it
Right.
after you use it for 5 to 10 casts, it becomes much more manageable.
Yep.
So,
Awesome.
anyways, this isn't a conversation about line, but I wanted to set those
It's a
parameters right.
system. Yeah, it's a system. The whole
Absolutely, it
thing's
is
a
a
system.
system.
Yeah.
So we have the parameters of kind of what we're looking at for lure weight ranges,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we have an idea of what we're looking at for line class and
Mm-hmm.
type, right? Which is
Mm-hmm.
probably like I said, 5 to 12, but really
Mm-hmm.
like 6 to 8 is a sweet pocket to be in for good
Mm-hmm.
serious bass fishing and a wide variety of lures, and
Mm-hmm.
use whatever line type you like. So now that comes into like, how does that fit onto the rod, and what can we do with those to take advantage of the rod? And you asked about rod length. So I think I said it last time, but really between 6 and 6.6, I think, in my opinion, is the sweet spot,
The
right?
traditional Japanese
That is the
tournament
traditional
bass
Japanese
length.
tournament
Yep.
bass
Yep.
sweet spot, right? You see a lot of 6.2, 6.4, 6.5s, right?
Right. Yep.
Daiwa likes to play with 6.8.
Mm-hmm.
So you get a little bit extra length there. That might really help, especially if you're doing vertical jigging or something like that, right? That
Sure.
little extra,
Yep.
like, because we did a lot. I get a lot of people asking me like, "Hey, I need 7 foot. I need 7.5 foot. I want to cast far." That's not going to make or break it.
Yeah.
Like going to a better line, a more aerodynamic lure, learning how to tune your reel
Yeah.
properly,
Yep.
that's what's gonna allow you to cast far, not the extra 4 to 5 inches on a ultralight to light power rod, in
Yep.
my opinion.
Yep.
So, if you're using an 8 foot rod versus a 6, yeah, okay, there's going to be a difference there, right? But if
Right.
you're talking 6.6 to 7 or six
Yeah.
four to 6.8, I honestly believe you're not going to see any real difference from the rod, right? The
Right.
difference is going to be the line and your casting ability. You do not want to swing these things like a baseball bat. It is a
Right.
very fluid, very let the rod, it's like a fly rod almost, right? Like let
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
rod load, let the rod unload, be super fluid with it,
Right.
and it will flow off the spool. So,
Yeah. If you
all right.
try to like power overhand, okay, and we can talk about this all day, or someone just buy one, try one, go out, and in 10 casts, you're gonna understand what Amir is talking about because I
Mm-hmm.
learned it the hard way. And and it happened to me on this trip, right? You switch reels and you get excited and you go to just absolutely crank one. And it's like, right?
It happens to
Slow
me too,
down
man.
and
And I've been doing this for many, many years. It
yeah.
happens.
But there is definitely that sweet stroke, and I agree with you. I do think it is more like a fly stroke than a traditional bait casting stroke,
Mhm.
and more of a lob than a power two-handed cast.
Yeah.
And once you feel it, and once you feel the rod loading and helping you, and the reel not over accelerating and kind of getting too fast and overloaded, it's real easy to continue to feel that and to just work with that from there. So
Yeah.
don't
And it
don't be
actually,
scared of it from the technical casting accuracy, or mechanics. If you can run a bait caster, you can figure this out. But it is different.
and that's a big part of as well why we want that slightly shorter length, right?
Yeah.
Is because we're not chucking these things over our heads, like
Right.
you
Yeah.
said, right?
Right.
What we're doing is we're casting sidearm low to the ground a lot of times because you want to
Mhm.
keep the projection or the trajectory of the lure low, right?
Right.
So you don't make a huge splash and you get better accuracy that way.
Right.
You're also applicable on bass, but especially when you get into like the creek fishing and that super tight water trout fishing and stuff,
Right.
you're doing a lot of across your body
Yep.
casting, and you're doing a lot of underhand casting where you hold the rod right out in front of you and you flip
Aaron
it.
Lowe, my sales guy, are you listening? This is so funny because he was struggling a little bit with the casting in the boat, and switching between different rods and reels. And he was actually killing them on some marabou jigs we tied,
Okay.
like 16-ounce marabou jigs, which are a very effective lure on the White River anywhere there's trout. And that's what he was killing them on that. And as soon as we were changing position in the boat and letting people do different stuff, and who's drifting down first and getting the first shot at every spot, and what are they fishing. And as soon as we moved him to where he sort of needed to cast across his body, all his problems went away.
Mm.
100%. It was
Yeah.
really interesting, right? And that was just enough to slow him down and take him out of his power stroke, and it like magically worked. So that's like brilliant advice. I can attest to the wisdom you were sharing because I've seen it happen firsthand.
One thing I tend to do a lot, and I see especially like in the trout and the creek guys, right, where you're fishing tight waters down a lot, is really what you do is you practice your across your body stroke, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's how you cast it out there, and you get that down. And then what you do when you want to aim somewhere else, you move your body
Yeah.
so that your stroke
Keep your
is
mechanics consistent.
always the
Yeah.
same, right?
Same as fly
Um,
fishing. Right. Yeah.
exactly, right.
Yeah.
You have a very consistent way
Right.
that you cast and you position your body to move the lure where you
Right.
want it to be,
Right.
rather than trying to adjust your cast. So,
No, yeah. It's like it's exactly like if you're a shotgun shooter having a super consistent mount, and all you change is where you're pointing your front foot for where you want to go, right?
mhm.
It's like he's showing his body mechanics for those who are watching on video, and you'll get exactly, but it looks almost like the consistency you're talking about in the mechanics, same as shooting, probably same as hitting a baseball, or shooting a
Absolutely, yeah,
basketball or anything else, right?
exactly, right.
Yeah. So talk
Yeah.
to me a little bit about, let's get into the handles and handle lengths. And so most of the ones that I've fished, and I like this, it was sort of novelty when I looked at them, but then once you get out and fish them, they have a shorter handle, and it's
Hmm.
inherently typically a one hand cast, right? Which
Yeah,
very
absolutely.
often in traditional bass gear or inshore bait casting gear, two hands, right? Two hands, a
Hmm.
longer butt, whatever. These tend to be shorter length handles, one hand cast, and it works really well for this. And you
Yes.
don't have any problems fighting fish that way. So let's
No.
talk about the handle kind of system a little bit as the part of the rod. What are
Okay.
you looking for? What do you like? What have you learned?
Um, so again, sticking to the idea of that like kind of tournament bass, right? It is going
Mhm.
to be a shorter length handle. Oftentimes, most of the time, you're looking for like a split grip type of
Mhm.
setup, right? And that's
Mhm.
just because um, it reduced the weight. The whole thing is so light, right?
Yeah,
And
incredibly
really, the
light.
aim is to keep this as light, as crisp, as sensitive as we can when we're using such small lures. You want that every little bit extra pickup, right? So not deadening it with a huge piece of EVA or a huge piece of foam, but rather just a
Right.
nice tight split grip design. You're
Mhm.
not really ever two-handed casting these things because you're just going to blow up your reel if you put that kind of force into it. So let me show you. I'm going to grab one and measure it or anything, but you can see kind of against my hand, for
Mhm.
those of you that are um, on video on YouTube. You can
What's
see
the length on this rod, Amir?
this particular rod.
Yep.
I believe it's 6'4",
Okay, so he's got a 6'4" rod, and he's looking at
6'2". Sorry, six
yeah,
two.
6'2", and this split grip is probably 6 to 7 inches from the butt to the trigger, right? So it is a shorter.
Yeah, it's about probably 7 inches,
Okay,
something
seven
like that
inches.
range.
Okay,
Yeah,
yep, yep.
and you got probably 2 inches of cork at the bottom, 3 inches of blank showing, and maybe I don't know.
Three and a half, three and three
Yeah, something
quarter
like
inch
that on
butt
the
grip.
handle
Yeah,
side, right?
yep,
And you use a nice small trigger on the real seat.
yep. And if you're
So,
not, if
and
you're
it's a
not
compact.
watching this, don't worry. We're gonna put some pictures up. We're gonna put some recipes up. I'm gonna put together some recipes on how I'm building mine so far now that I've gotten into this and what I've learned, right? But one of the first things I learned was don't make the handle too long, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen a lot of newer companies come into the scene saying, "Hey, here's our bait finesse rod," and you grab that handle and you're like, "Whoa,
Too long.
where did you
Yeah.
pull this off of?" You know what I
Right.
mean?
Yeah.
You want a
Which is
nice compact
the
handle.
assembly line.
And a big part of that, right? I'm going to go back to kind of showing that body motion.
Right. Yeah.
You don't want a handle that's smacking your arm,
Yeah.
that's
Right.
hanging up in your clothes. You're doing a lot of tight casting, right?
Right.
Again, remember the point of this isn't to cast your lure far, it's to cast your lure with accurate
Accurately. Right.
point accuracy,
Right.
and then the ability to set that hook and move that fish away very quickly,
Right.
right?
Yep.
And so you want to handle that plays to those
Hmm.
that gives you advantage to those points, right?
Right.
Something that's tight, that's compact, that's comfortable, that's lightweight, and just kind of stays out of the way. Honestly, that's what you
Yep.
need the handle to do, is stay out of your way.
Right.
Now, there are other handle designs that are used, especially
Sure.
in the uh, trout world, right?
Yeah.
A lot
Yep.
of those rods will have even shorter handles. They'll
Right.
be not a split grip,
Right.
but rather just a nice, basically as if you cut it off right there, almost like a pistol grip, right? But
Yeah,
without.
like an old pistol grip, but sometimes in pistol shape, sometimes not. Sometimes at a
Yeah,
straight angle,
pistol
sometimes
grip
you don't.
without the
Yeah,
pistol shape. But honestly, I've
exactly.
seen
Right.
ones with the pistol shape. I've seen
Yep.
ones set at an angle, which is to really help with the underhand
Yeah.
casting, flip
Right.
casting. So there's a lot of things you could do with the handle. But at the end
Yeah.
of the day, for this particular application we're talking about today, and probably for most bait finesse applications, you want it tight, compact, comfortable, and out of the way.
Yep. Yep. It's funny you mentioned that. I brought back some of these traditional kind of Andrews fishing and Just Ace kind of wood and metal, reel seats with the cork grips, these very
Mhm.
traditional trout style BFS handles. And so when I went to Arkansas, I had a pile of rods, right? I took 18 rods or something that I was just trying to try out blanks, try out configuration setups, multi-piece, single, one piece, all this stuff. And it's funny, both the guides who are fly guys at heart gravitated so heavily towards those. They're like, wow, I've never seen a casting seat with a beautiful piece of stabilized wood in it. You're
Oh
like,
yeah,
fly
it's
guys.
real big in the
Yeah.
trout world
Oh,
over there.
huge. Right. Yeah. And that's
Yeah.
cool. Use whatever you want, but it doesn't change that it's a relatively compact handle.
Yep.
And that's on purpose. And once you get
On
out there and
purpose. Yeah.
fish it, you'll see why it actually works for you, not against you. So you're not doing it wrong. If the handle seems short to you, that's the right way to do it. Let's talk a little bit about, the guides, right? Because again, as part of the tackle system, you mentioned this a couple of times in the first episode. Obviously, as a guide person, I'm super dialed in on this, but it is an interesting part. These are lighter generally, weight and power. That's another thing you mentioned. I'm so glad you brought it up because I really haven't touched on it. But one of the fun things about fishing these things is all in the whole rig is like a wand. I mean, it is air
Hmm.
light. It is literally so light in total weight, right? But that doesn't mean that things like balance, and all go out the window just because it's an ultralight or kind of a finesse application. So in order to keep these light rods with shorter handles and light components balanced, we tend to use smaller guides and a
Yes.
smaller guide train. So let's talk about, and you mentioned the passing knots. Let's talk about kind of what you typically would advise people to look for
So
in a dedicated BFS guide train.
yeah, absolutely. So I mean, first decide your line type, right?
Right.
If you're a braid guy, you're gonna be using braid, your customer's gonna be using braid, whatever, right? You're set on using braid. You are going to want to make sure that you have a darn good FG knot
Mm-hmm.
and that
Yeah.
you have a guide big enough for your FG knot to pass through,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's
Yep.
that's 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 the first thing there, is really deciding that. Now, as far as it what I would like and what I see a lot of these JDM tournament bass scene rods built like and what their guide configurations are like, right? Okay. So I really like kind of the formula going back to Yukihiro Sawamura in
Yep.
2007, 8, 9, right? The
Right.
first rod they developed, the 642, I mentioned it last time.
Yep.
That had what you would call a traditional guide train layout, right? They were smaller guides. I don't know exact sizes, but they're
Sure.
not
Yep.
anything, they were not super tiny. But it really only took one or two models released after that, right? He was tweaking and releasing these things
Sure.
faster than you could think of
Right.
before he kind of set the standard of micro guides
Yep.
within
Right.
the bait finesse kind of at least the bass tournament scene, right?
Yep.
You don't see them as much on the trout rods, and that's for reasons of how those particular blanks move. And you don't see it on all the bass rods, but
Yep.
the higher end tournament specific rods really tend to gravitate towards using micro guides.
Yep.
And that works really well because, like I said, you're using fluorocarbon most of the time with those, or
Yep.
the intention, at least from those rod builders, is that you're using a 5 to probably 10 pound fluorocarbon,
Right.
somewhere in that range,
Yep.
right? So you're not worried about passing knots through.
Right.
Now, one of the things that you see a lot with newer companies getting into bait finesse, or just more budget friendly bait finesse rods, is they tend to lack the proper amount of guides.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, because of the way that these rods bend, and I really hope we get a lot into action and stuff in a little bit here, but because of the way these rods bend, it should have more guides than you would think.
Yep. And so rod builders, this will make sense because a parabolic action that bends progressively through the whole thing often has more guides than a very fast action where the tip immediately is pointing at the fish and you only really have to worry about how many guides you've got in the butt. These, I can tell you right now, between casting and fighting fish, mostly in these rods, you are using the whole rod, right? And so it's,
Yes.
I agree with you. More and smaller guides are the ticket, right?
There's three parts to a blank, at least in my mind,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's three parts in the way that these particular blanks are built anyways. And each part of those, especially the upper two, are going to bend in particular situations. So, the first part is going to bend when you have that lure moving in the water. Second part is going to bend when the fish is on. That third part really is where your backbone and meat comes in. And we'll look at some blanks and discuss them. But when I say you should have more rod guides than you expect, like I said, this particular rod I have in my hand, and I grabbed this rod because it's like this is the industry standard right now for the high-end tournament guys, right? I don't
Okay.
want to get into rod brands and stuff, but this was designed by Yukihiro Sawamura. It was released in 24. It's like the highest end kind of tournament level bait finesse rod in Japan
Is
right
it
now.
one you carry at Bait
It
Finesse?
is not, because
Okay.
it would sell for way more
Okay. Okay.
than I feel
Yep.
comfortable putting on a website at this
I
point.
hear you. I hear you.
But let me do a quick count. I want to say it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 plus one. So a 6'2" rod,
With 11 guides and a tip top. Yep.
11
Yep.
plus one, right? So
So
that's
that's
the
more
number
than
we're talking
typical.
about.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
that is far more than typical. I think most 6'2" rod casting rods, right, are going to have like a 7 plus one and 8 plus
7
one.
to 8. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
And the reason you want those extra guys is exactly like you were saying, Bill. The rod is going to bend, and it's going to bend deeply when it's doing its job. And you want to keep that line controlled.
Yep.
And you also want to avoid, um, I've seen it. I've taken pictures of it on other rods where you bend that tip down and the line goes under the blank and then
Yep.
back up to the next guide.
Right.
And
Yep.
when that happens, one, you don't have the control you should have, right? Because it's not spreading it over the blank. But two, you also run the risk, especially if you're using braids and you hook into a big fish that's going to pull, you run the risk of that braid cutting your blank because it
Yep.
will rub on the blanket,
Yep.
especially towards the tip where that blanket's super thin. You don't want the braid rubbing on the rod blank.
Yep. Yep. So
Oh,
and I think rod builders get that. That's so just know that you're going to use more guides on a rod like this, and that's okay, right? And I
absolutely.
personally, I played around. I took a bunch of rods built with guides on top. I took a bunch of rods built with spiral wraps, to see like,
Yes.
and the reality is you end up using, normally you're able to use fewer and smaller guides with the spiral. With these rods, it didn't change a whole lot the number of guides the rod needed to be properly put
Because of
together.
how
And
much they bend
Yeah,
in that
and
upper
I'd also
section.
tell you, if you're not watching, you can't see this, but I'll tell you this too. The first guide, the first what we might call the stripper guide, right? The first
Hmm.
one is often closer to, right? So not only are you using more, it's often closer to the reel when it's where it needs to be than it is on a traditional bass rod
Yeah,
setup.
and I think a part of that, right? I'm not a rod builder, but I would
Yep.
imagine that a big part of that is because a lot of these reels, not all of them, but a lot of them they're ultra small. Like
Low
everyone's
profile.
comfortable with a low profile reel, but these are even smaller, right?
Yep,
Like you might
they
have a
are.
100, 150 size reel on your regular medium heavy bass rod. These are 50 to 70
Yep.
class reels, so they
Right.
sit much tighter
Right.
to
That's
the reel
exactly right.
seat, and the whole package is nice and compact, right?
Right.
So you want to move that stripper guide or that first guide closer, and you also want to it's going to sit lower. It's not going to sit as
Yep.
high as it would on a conventional rod,
Exactly. Yeah,
and
you
they
nailed
will
it.
very quickly taper down.
Yep.
I actually measured, and the end guide, the tip top on this particular rod is 2 millimeter tip.
Hmm. Yep.
So it just shows you. And I was reading your article on micro guides, and people are complaining that 4 was too small and 5
Right.
is kind of
Right.
small.
Yeah.
But well, these are using twos
Yeah.
at the tip, right?
Right. Yeah.
So again,
Tiny.
think about the line type you're using,
Right.
and that's why I like to use a lot of fluorocarbon. If you
Right.
are going to be using braid, bump that up. Maybe use a
Yeah.
4, maybe use a 5.
Right.
You're a rod builder, not me, but that would be that's where I would go with it, train of thought
Yeah.
wise.
It seems like for what I was doing in saltwater and then reinforcing with kind of the lure range of trout stuff I was throwing, getting down to a size 4 was plenty. Now, again, I'm using titanium torzite, which I realize is a high end guide and very expensive. But, and again, some people probably fell out of their chair when we're talking about, 11 guides plus tip top on a rod this short. But when you understand that they're that small, it's very efficient. So you're not adding that much weight and it works, right?
Oh
And
yeah,
so,
no, these are
yeah,
all tiny. I mean, they're tiny, man. They
yeah, yeah.
don't hardly add any weight. And on this particular rod, it is using the titanium, the titanium
Torzite, yeah.
frames, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I believe it's torzite, but it could be the sick rings. I
Yeah,
forget off
one or
the top
the
of my
other if it's
head.
titanium. Yeah,
But
exactly.
exactly,
Yeah,
it's definitely the higher end of the Fuji stuff
yeah,
that's out
right.
there. So
And again, that's not to be snobby or JDM centric. It's when you get small like this, the weight is just so critical, right? And so if you just slop a bunch of oversized stainless frame guides on this thing, you run the risk of killing the action and
so
really making the rod inefficient.
now that said, you don't necessarily have to go as high end either,
Nope,
right?
not with
There's a
micros. You
lot of
don't have to.
guys. I
Yeah.
think the standard is probably going to be somewhere around like 8+1 to 9+1 on a
Hmm.
rod that range, right?
Hmm.
And a lot of times there. I mean, in the JDM world, I've never seen anyone use anything but Fuji, right?
Right. Yeah.
But you're gonna be
It's
using
because
that,
they're
and
smart.
yeah,
Because they're
well,
focused.
hey man, I've had no problem with it ever. So
I'm
I
just kidding.
I like what I like, and I like Fuji.
Well, me too. Yeah.
But you're gonna use like the A class rings, the Fuji Alkanite rings, right? Which
Yep.
are not the highest end, but they
But a
do give you
great
that
guide.
sensitivity.
Yeah.
They give you that heat dissipation and everything you want out of a high end guide.
Right.
And that's gonna be the standard. Obviously, if you want to build a rod under $100 or whatever, yeah, go with the Fuji O's, right? But or whatever your preferred brand is and their equivalent of it. There's no right or wrong answer, but the right answer is go as best as you can.
Yep. No, that's right. This is an application where it makes a difference, right? So it's
Absolutely, it
not.
does make a difference because you're
Yeah.
using such light weights a lot of times, right? If you're throwing a drop shot with a 1/16 ounce weight and a 3 inch worm, um, that pickup is going to be a lot lighter than if you're using a drop shot with a 1/4 inch weight and a 6 inch worm. You know what I mean? That they're
100%.
going to hit that worm differently, and you want to be able to discern the difference between a bite and a bump from a bluegill or
Yep.
whatever, right? Like
Yep.
and so that extra that little bit extra in the guides makes a big difference on the sensitivity at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Well, hey, you
So,
you mentioned action, and I know you want to talk about action, so this is important. And so let's get into it, right?
all right.
Walk me through that. Talk to me about the actions and what you're looking for, and what you like, and what you would educate people to sort of seek out or strive for.
So I think again, going back to Yukihiro Sawamura, 2007, 2008, is when he kind of developed the formula for the modern bait finesse rod, right?
Hmm.
There were older versions and different ways people did it before, and there's still different ways that people do it now. But I think he really set a formula that is the blueprint for what people are following today. And really, there's you can almost say there's two formulas, honestly. It depends on how much technology you want to put into the blank itself, right? But what you if you want to do everything bass rod, you want to throw some jigs, you want to throw some drop shot, and then you want to switch to a 2-inch crankbait, and then you want to switch to a 1/8 ounce spinnerbait. Your best bet, if you could only have one rod to take with you for bait finesse, is honestly probably going to be a moderate fast,
Okay.
right? And that is kind of like it's going to give you the sensitivity and the power to set hooks with the single stuff, but it's going to bend enough for the moving baits, for your spinner
Right.
baits, and for your
Yep.
trebles and your cranks, right? That is the if you can only have one, and you're not able to get super picky with high-end blank technologies that make the blanks do almost unnatural things. If you can't get into that level of blank, then a nice moderate fast action, or even a fast action that is just more supple than a
Hmm.
standard fast action, right?
Hmm.
Because those are words that people throw around and they could really mean
Right.
anything until you
Right.
actually get your hands on it and feel it. You don't really know,
Right.
but something that's supple in the tip, something that's going to let that tip move, not only to keep your hooks pinned, your small hooks pinned, but also so that you can work the baits without jerking the baits way too far, right?
Hmm.
And also so that you could still have the power to set the hooks and move fish away. A moderate fast action is great for that. Now, that said, right around the same time, Yukihiro Sawamura was coming out, with these formulas for bait finesse rods. Obviously, blank technology is always changing, and around that time is really like when, at least in the JDM world, using there's all kinds of marketing terms for these, but using
Right.
the cross weaving, right,
Yeah.
where you
The
got
cross weave and
the
some of
X
the, yeah.
weave patterns, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Using, I forget the marketing term Timco was using at the time, but incorporating Kevlar
Hmm.
into the blanks.
Yeah.
Um,
And so what Amir's referring to, and this is not limited to BFS, but
no,
it is
absolutely not. You can use this.
especially useful in some of these, again, applications where we're really pushing the limits of what the gear can do, right? Where we're
Yep.
sort of in the red, not sort of safely in the green in the middle of the scale. And they started using different fibers, oriented different ways and different scrims to sort of be able to use less material while maintaining the same strength and hoop strength and everything else like this. And it essentially makes a lighter, better performing rod without sacrificing durability, right?
But it also, and I'm not a blank builder, and I might just be, in my head with some of the marketing I've
Send
seen
it.
over there,
Send it.
but it also allows you to give the three distinct parts of the blank, which is your tip, your belly, and your
Yeah.
butt. It allows you to put different
Different
actions
actions in there, right?
into each
Distinct three
part.
zone rods. Yep.
Exactly,
Hmm.
distinct 3 zone or at least 2 zone
Right.
rods, right?
Yep.
Where instead of just it being fast and it always bends right there, no matter how
Right.
much force you put on it, or
Right.
instead of it being moderate, where it always bends at the middle, no
Right.
matter,
Yeah.
you can get rods that, depending on the load, will bend in different ways.
Start to
And
have a
that
more progressive action. Yeah. Right.
progressive action is
Yeah.
exactly the key for that. Now, that said, and throwing a little bit of more history back into it, progressive action has always been a thing, especially in the fly world and the ultralight spinning world, right? Especially
Yep.
when you're talking trout guys and panfish guys and stuff like that.
Right.
But really, like that idea and concept was amplified and incorporated into bait finesse really around that Yukihiro Sawamura 2007, 2008 time period. And
Mm-hmm.
what they started doing was building rods that they call multi-taper, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now on paper, when you look at the blank, it's going to say fast action most of the time. Those are going
Right.
to say fast action. But I think this rod is, and I'm going to back up a little bit, and I don't know for those of you on YouTube, hopefully you can see it, but this rod is rated as a fast action. You got a tip that is
Yeah.
very fast. I don't know
Yeah.
if anyone can see that, but it is. It's very fast. You're going to
Right.
have sensitivity. You're going to have quick hook pickup and stuff like that. But when you put more load in this blank,
Yeah.
you can see that it
It
does
starts to
really
behave much
start.
more like a moderate. Yeah.
It
Exactly.
starts bending like a moderate
Certainly
fast, at
multiple
least a
zones. Yeah.
moderate fast, right? But
Yep.
it's not what you would normally label a moderate fast because the tip
Is fast. Right. Yep.
is fast. It's super responsive and faster than your moderate fast crankbait rod would be, for
Right.
example, right?
Yeah.
So that is the standard bass tournament rod blank formula, right?
Yep.
If you don't have a fancy blank with some of these technologies they use where I could see this thing is the X wrap down here and then it tapers off and then that blank gets super thin, right?
Right.
Like, and if you don't have that, then go for a moderate fast.
Yeah.
A moderate fast is going to be a workhorse. It's going to do everything for you.
Yep.
But if you do have the ability to find and play with blanks, and maybe someone builds you a blank, or you know where to find some of these higher end blanks, look for something that is, at least from a marketing perspective, they call it multi-taper, right?
Yep.
Where that tip is pretty darn fast, but then it progressively loads.
Yep.
But then it doesn't bend all the way to the handle like a trout rod would.
Right.
It does hit a really strong, solid backbone in
Yeah.
that lower third of the rod.
Right.
And you need that because we're talking about tournament bass fishing, and you're going to be catching 5, 6, 8 pound bass on a
You
16
hope.
ounce jig, you hope, right? And you need to get them away from that log or that
Right.
rock pile or that grass or whatever
Right.
before they wrap you up, and then
Right.
you're stuck. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So you have to be able to set that hook quickly and turn them. And
Right.
that is what these rods do. So you're looking for a moderate fast or a multi-taper type of blank, right?
Yep.
Now, that is the formula. That is the standard. That is the, hey, I have, I want one badass bait finesse rod to take and do jigs and cranks and spinnerbaits and everything,
Right.
chatterbaits with it. That is that. But if you're really getting into the weeds with bait finesse and now you want technique specific rods, right? Because bait finesse
Or you don't
approach,
bass fish, you trout fish, you pan fish, you saltwater inshore fish. Yeah, there are others, right?
well, of course there's others.
There's a world.
I want to show two more
Please.
bass rod blanks.
Yeah.
Here. Now these are a combo, right? Like these are a rod combo. I would never go out to the lake with only one of these. I bring both of them, right?
Right.
And why is that? Is because you have your bait rod and your moving bait rod, right?
Okay.
Your soft bait rod and your moving bait rod. Now this one in my hand here, it's a 6'2".
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, 6'2" again. This is it's called the so-called finesse. It's a Jackson rod, and this is your soft bait rod.
Okay.
Now this particular rod, I forget if they call it a fast or an extra fast, but it's extra fast.
Yeah.
Like, and
Definitely
that's what
faster
it.
than the
It
last
doesn't
one. Yeah.
progressively load up like that other rod.
Right. Yep.
This is it. This is how this rod bends, right?
Yep.
Now, why would you want a rod that doesn't bend as deep as that other rod? Well, that's because you're going to be using this for jigs. You're going to be using this for Texas rigs. You're going to be using this for your wackies, your Neckos, where you got to set that hook and turn them very quickly and just reel the crap out of it and get them in, right?
Yep. Yep.
Now, how do they accomplish this? Well, one, they X wrap the blank basically the whole way up to here, right? So this, yeah, it's got
Two-thirds
some
of the
flex
overall
in there.
length.
It's got to have some forgiveness,
Yeah.
but this is a very stiff rod for, you hand this to someone, you say, hey, it's a bait finesse rod. They're going to be surprised at how stiff it is in this section.
Okay. Yep.
And then what they do up here, this top, maybe 12 inches, this is a solid carbon tip.
Yep.
So they splice a solid carbon tip
into the tip of the tube.
into a nice stiff, fast action blank.
Right.
That gives you a tip that is super supple and can move basically independently of the rest of the rod.
Right.
You're going to visually see that
super
move.
durable. Yeah.
Super durable.
Right.
These tips are super strong. Whenever you do see one break, and I've never seen this particular Jackson one break, but I have seen some other brands. It's always at the splice.
Yeah. Right.
It's not the tip itself that breaks, but it's the splice comes undone.
It's the natural shape.
Again, I haven't seen it with the Jackson ones, but I have seen some other brands do that. Nonetheless, this gives you a super fast, this is like your jig and worm rod that everyone has on their bass boat.
Right.
But just downsize.
BFS downsize.
To throw it on 6-pound line instead of 14-pound line or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And then, like I said, they're kind of a combo because now the other rod.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Way more. But you can see multiple zones there as you're bending it. Yeah.
Oh, you can still see multiple zones. This is rated as a moderate fast, right? It's not a moderate or a slow where it bends all the way to the blank. Right. But this is definitely your moving bait rod. And you can see how that bends compared to the other one, right? For those
clearly a different action optimized for moving baits, top waters, blade baits, crank baits, jerk baits, things like that. Yeah. Good treble hook rod instead of where the other one we may have a big single we got to set. This definitely helps you connect to and stay buttoned up better.
Now this particular one, as part of the Jackson set. This one is all solid. What that means is if I were to break this right now, it's not a tube, it's not
Yeah.
hollow,
Right.
it's not
Yep.
a straw. This is a solid piece of carbon the whole way through.
Yep.
Just like the tip on that other rod, right? But this
Yep.
one is the whole way through. And what that does is it gives you a super limber, super durable rod. Um, I love using this rod. It feels like one of those metal, not metal, elastic bands, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
go to the gym, you pull that elastic band, you stretch it, you stretch it. As soon as you let go, and
Right
that's how
back.
this rod
Yeah.
feels, right? You hook a big size bass on here, it pulls, it stretches, it pushes it, it pushes it. It's bending in half. As soon as they let up pressure, you feel the bass rubber band right back to you,
Yeah. Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
So why I wanted to show those two ones is because yeah, today I think we're talking about the one do it all rod blank that we were talking about earlier, but I wanted to show that you can get as technique specific as you want, right?
Right.
Bait finesse itself is I wouldn't call it a technique, it's an approach that
Right.
you that
Yeah. And as I'm sitting here listening to you talk and watching you show these actions, I mean, it's just, the same principles are true for even conventional bass or
Mhm,
heavier saltwater stuff. If
absolutely.
you have a different action for a rod, you got to drive home a big single hook, right? In a worm or a jig or pitching, flipping, punching rod, or even a big topwater frog rod where you got to throw in slop and really stick a fish when they eat it. That's different than what you're going to throw for a top water, what you're going to throw for a rattle trap or a blade bait, what you're going to throw for. Yeah. So it's really is the same principles. It's just there is a
Downstairs.
lot of technology built into these BFS blanks. And I think, again, understand that's not because they're trying to pile as much as they can into this small package. It's that the application requires it, right? You're
Yep.
absolutely maxing the lightweights you can throw on these reels. The rod is supporting you in doing that, but you're still fishing for a big fish in cover that you got to be able to move away. And again, I until you have fished one of these little reels, and it's so funny because it's so parallel to slow pitch jigging for me. When I first went out 9+ years ago and started slow pitch jigging, was going out on these boats with these tiny little compact powerful reels. It was like, dude, you can't catch a red snapper on that, you can't catch a grouper on that, you're going to get wiped out by an amberjack. Actually you can, right? And now that's gotten old hat to me, but I almost had like a tiny dose of that same thing, Amir, when we're hooking these big trout, even on this 4 pound fluoro. With the revolving spool reel just gives you so much leverage, right? And the
Mhm.
ability to use your thumb if you need to momentarily add a little more pressure. That's a lot harder to do on a spinning reel. You can do it, kind of reach up and slow the spool, but it's easier on this. And then, again, just the accuracy, it kind of blew me away, right? So I know we probably have a curve of people listening to this episode, people that already are all in and believe and they know and they're nodding their heads yes because they've tried it. A group in the middle that's kind of like, this is interesting, maybe I'll try it. And then some cynics at the end is like, this is nuts. Why would you do this? Why do you need to do this? And it's all I can tell you is pick up a rod and try it. Fish for some of the fish you normally fish for, unless
Yeah.
you're like only exclusively a bluefin tuna guy,
No.
or all you ever do is drop deep daytime for swordfish or something. Yes, there are applications this doesn't make sense, but I'm telling you, if you're fishing any kind of still water, pond, creek, lake, river, anything,
Anything that falls within the realm of what I would call light game species.
yeah, absolutely
So
try
your
it. I'm
bass, your
telling
trout,
you.
your panfish, your
Yeah.
even reasonable sized pike, stuff like
Yep.
that.
I know
So
this could be a whole other episode, and I'm aware that we've already got an hour of great stuff from you. But if I push my luck just a little bit, I do want to. We don't have to drain the swamp on this one, but I do want to mention it, and that's another thing that's been a clear epiphany for me. Right, these reels are also very specialized, highly designed, constructed particularly and specifically and optimized for this application. Okay. So, full disclosure, I took a bunch of BFS reels and I took some smaller, 70 size, 100 size, not BFS reels from some of the same brands and just put not as much line on them and light line on them, threw them out there and tried them. And I can tell you, again, Don't sleep on the dedicated BFS rods. Don't sleep on the dedicated BFS reels. These things really do help you be successful. They help you
Yes.
cast better. They have lighter, smoother, and more adjustable drags at the lights. Like just they have tend to have a little bit higher gear ratio. Like talk just briefly, and again, I know this could be a whole other episode, but talk to us just a little bit, Amir, about these reels and what makes them different and special, and why if you're going to try this, again, it sounds like we're trying to sell people a bunch of gear, but the reality is the reel is an incredibly important part of this tackle system. And if you get everything else right and you don't get the reel right, you're going to struggle. So,
The reel is the one part you have to get right,
right.
honestly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Everything else, you do have a little bit of leeway and you can
Right.
play around with it. And,
Right.
like going just to go on rods, right? If you don't follow the formula I gave you right now for the rod blank and the guides or whatever, you could still successfully fish
Right.
small lures, right? Before this kind of formula was developed in Japan, the formula prior to that was using very moderate rods, right? So they would
Yeah.
just bend deep and load and be able to cast small lures, and that absolutely works. Not going to
Yeah.
have the sensitivity and control and everything you do with these more modern rods, but you can get away with that. Now, the reel, on the other hand, there's only so much you can do with a reel, right?
Right.
As
Yeah.
with until you have to get the specialized reels.
Yeah.
Now, it used to be, and we mentioned this last time, right? It used to be where like quarter ounce was like, wow, if you could cast a quarter ounce with a bait caster, that was finesse, right?
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
what those old Abus did, for
Right.
example, right?
Yeah.
And that was the best at the time, and it was awesome. But really, like as time went on and these reels got more and more technology poured into them, what happened is not only did the frames get smaller, which that's just a comfort and a fitting on the rod and keeping the reel light kind of thing, but really what happened is the spools got smaller
Mm-hmm.
as far as the actual diameter of the spool, right?
Mm-hmm.
Standard bait casters nowadays tend to be like 34 millimeter
Mm-hmm.
diameter, the
Mm-hmm.
spool. Um, Bait finesse reels 15, 20 years ago were about 32 millimeter. Now they're 28, 29,
Yeah.
30 is like a big bait finesse reel
Right.
for like serious bass tournament fishing. You might have a 30. Your
Yeah.
trout guys are definitely using like 28s and 29s. And the reason for that, right? It's like, okay, smaller spool, cool, less line. But why? The idea is, yes, it does have less line. That it's purposefully making you put less line on it
It
so that
has
you can
less mass, so
it's
you
less
have less
mass.
startup inertia. Yeah.
Exactly. So you could
Yeah.
reduce the weight of the whole contraption that has to spin inside of your reel, which
Yeah.
is what's dispensing the line to get that lure out there, right?
Yeah.
These lures, even an eighth ounce lure, is not really in and of itself heavy enough to move a spool, make it the spool spin on a conventional 34 millimeter,
Yeah.
spool, bait casting spool.
Yeah.
But these smaller spools, they're smaller, so they're lighter, so you could purposely fit less line and still be able to manage that line, right?
Right.
Because
Yeah.
like you said, you can put less line on a standard one and it gets you halfway
It
there.
helps, but it's
It
not the
helps.
whole deal.
It
Yeah,
helps.
it's
Right?
definitely
And
not.
there's reels that are better than it. Just to throw brands out there,
Mhm.
you have the Daiwas with the SVs, right?
Yeah, the never
The
adjust,
SV,
or what do they call them? Yeah, yeah.
the SV Boost, right?
Right.
That
Yeah, yeah.
the SV series Daiwas, whether it's the Tattoo SV or whatever, those tend to use a little bit smaller spool, and the braking is better for finesse. That's
Hmm.
what I would call a finesse bait caster,
Hmm.
not a
Yep.
bait finesse bait caster, but a finesse bait
Finesse
caster.
baitcaster.
You
Yeah.
can usually cast anything over an eighth ounce with
Yeah.
that fairly well, right?
Hmm.
And the Shimano's equivalent is just going to be the MGL stuff, right? If you see a Shimano that says MGL on it,
Hmm.
you could do finesse with it, right?
Yeah.
But when you go to a Shimano BFS or a Daiwa BF, a Daiwa bait finesse reel,
Right.
right? Or
Yeah.
air reel as they call them in Japan often.
Exactly.
The difference is the amount of control. Even if you're casting the same weight, right? And
It's
you
super
just get way
noticeable
more
immediately.
control.
Yeah. Yeah.
The braking is more fine-tuned.
Way
Uh,
more
and
fine-tuned.
it just allows these reels they're very airy feeling,
Hmm.
right? Like the
Yep.
spools they're they're slick, they're smooth, everything's airy feeling. The higher end reels, especially, you really notice it where things just move easily. You're not having to force things to move, and that's how you want your
Yeah.
reel to feel. Um,
Yeah.
Everyone, especially new to bass fishing, goes online, goes to YouTube, says, "How do I dial in my bait caster?" And you see a guy tie a quarter ounce jig at the end and he turns his little knob and waits for it to fall. You do not want that, right?
Yeah.
If it's
That's
slowing that
yeah, it's not
lure
for
down at all, if
BFS.
it's
Yeah.
controlling the lure when it falls, right?
Yeah.
Because you dialed it in like that, you're hampering the lure's ability to move and get the line out there.
Yeah,
You
and
want to
I
dial
gotta
these.
tell one on myself here. When I first got my very first, and I'm talking this is just a few months ago, when I first got my very first reels, that's how I'd always started out of the box with a
Mhm.
casting reel. And I tuned it up. I was having so much trouble. And then I had Aaron and my purchasing and supply chain guy David come over, and we fished together, and we were all blowing them up. And it's like, what is going on? And then I finally watched Jimmy's video about how to tune a BFS reel, and literally, people, you're tuning it so loose that the spool, you're judging it not based on how fast it's spinning or how the lure is dropping or anything else, but the lateral movement of the spool, that the click back and forth is not too loud, that there's a little bit of move. And as soon as I started tuning them the way Jimmy said, like literally 90% of my problems went away. But
You
again,
want
different application, different way to set up the reels.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly. And I recommend anyone who's new to these reels, or maybe you're not new to the reels, but you're not getting the
You're
distance you want.
struggling with the reels. Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
struggling with it,
Yeah.
especially if you're not getting the distance you want. This is probably your answer, right?
Yeah. It is.
Other than making sure you have a good line on there and it's smooth and light enough and not too much of it. But as far
Not
as
too much.
dialing the reel in, you want 1 to 2 millimeters.
Right.
So look at that on a ruler, and that's just two
It's
hairs stacked basically.
right.
You want 1 to 2 millimeters of play
Right.
in the spool. So what
Right.
that means, right? For again, guys on YouTube, I open, I press the button here so that
Right. To
it's
disengage. Right.
loose, and you
It'll
can't
actually
see it or
move a
hear
little
it, but
side to side. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. It moves a little side to side, and you want 1 to 2 millimeters of play. Now, when you do that and you let go and you watch the lure at the end, it's gonna fall. It's gonna
Right.
fall. Nothing is hampering it, and
Right.
that's what you want.
Right.
You want this little dial on the side just to control the spool enough so it's not flopping around on you.
Right. Right.
All the rest of that lure control comes from dialing in your brakes, start
Yep.
high and work your way down,
Right.
and have a good thumb. We mentioned this last time.
Yep.
Bait finesse is super fun. If you're comfortable with a bait caster, you could get into it, but this is not how you learn to use a bait caster. I would
Right.
recommend
No,
you
I
learn
agree.
on a standard bait caster with 12-pound mono or whatever first. Once you know how to control your thumb, and it's a learning process. Every day I get better with it. I've been doing it for decades, right?
Right.
But once you learn to control your thumb, then you can start really dialing those brakes down.
Mhm.
And I mean, at the end of the day, if you could have no tension on the spool and no brakes at all, that's optimal.
Right.
But
For
then your thumb
distance.
has to
Yeah.
be real good.
Right.
You know
Yeah.
what I
Yeah.
mean?
And I
Like,
will tell you, you are able to get to a point where, and maybe you're sacrificing some distance, but you can get to where if you tune him this way. And again, um, there's Jimmy's video on raw fishing is awesome. Amir just described it perfectly. You can get them to where don't let that scare you off. You can use more brake and get them to where you almost don't have to thumb them at all. You are just going to give
absolutely.
up potentially some casting distance, right? So,
Yeah, no,
and
absolutely.
in some fisheries, in some applications, that doesn't matter that much. In sometimes it's everything, right? So just know. But yeah, I appreciate you touching on the reels, because it is, based on my experience, it really is a critical part of the whole tackle system.
And
And I can see people being like, well, I want to try it, but I'm just going to try it with the reel I already have. You'd be better off trying it with a rod you already have
I agree.
than
You
a
can
reel
grab
you
a
already have,
you can
in
grab a
my opinion.
medium power rod, and
Yeah,
if you have a bait finesse reel, a real deal, but you could get away with casting an 1/8 ounce, a 1/4 ounce probably, right? You're not
100%.
gonna get real tiny, but you can get away with it. It's not gonna be as sensitive or have as much control as you want over a lure that small with
Right.
that kind of rod. But you can, if you have the reel, you can get away with it. And let me actually touch on two more quick things on the reel, and then going into an application I've seen that was really interesting. I thought I'd at least throw it out there. The reel, and now this is a horrible example of me because I brought this, but you see this reel. It's on the right hand. I don't know if the videos maybe flip for you or whatever,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
honestly, it should be on the left, right? Because I'm a right-handed person,
Right.
and we all have learned in the USA to
Yeah, yeah.
cast and switch
Yeah.
hands.
Yeah.
It's quite honestly, man, it's dumb. We all
Yeah.
do
Right.
it,
Right.
but
Right.
it's dumb. There's
But
no
it's
reason for it.
backwards. Yeah.
We're
Yeah.
talking about making your handle short for efficiency, building these high-end blanks so you have efficiency and instant line setting and
And
hook.
now we're going to
And then
switch
now
hands
all of a
on
sudden
every
you're
single cast. Yeah.
juggling.
Yeah. Yeah.
For
Right.
really, like, if you're a right-handed angler, you want that reel on the left and it's a pain in the butt the first few hours you're using it. I at this point I can switch easily. I pick up one or the other, I can cast it, I have no problem. You do have to force yourself to go out there and practice with a left-hand reel if you're not
Right.
used to it, or if you're a left-handed person, get a right-handed reel.
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense to dial in all of your equipment and your handles and all these exact measurements and guides, and then you're just fumbling the whole thing
Yeah.
because you're the point of this is efficiency and accuracy,
Yeah.
and that's only going to be better if you're not having to switch hands. On top of that, you're working the lure, a
With your
small
strong
lure.
hand. Yeah.
You want you want the hand that has the more dexterity in it
Right.
to be able to make those minute, tiny shakes that make a huge difference on a small
On a
lure.
tiny lure. Right. Yeah.
Exactly,
Like
right?
a Tiemco red pepper micro or nano.
Exactly.
Right. Like, yeah.
Exactly. One of those, right? You can't jerk it the same way you would a normal size lure because it'll
Right.
just come flying right back at you at the bank. You
Right.
know what I mean?
Right.
You
Yeah.
you have to be able to do extreme subtlety, extreme
Yeah.
dexterity. It is worth, and like I said, for whatever reason, I ended up grabbing one of my right hand reels, but really, like honestly,
It
this
looks
should
left
be
on
on
the
the
video.
left.
It'll be fine.
Yeah,
It looks left on
exactly.
the
It
video. The
should be
camera
on the
reversed
left.
it.
It's
Saved
it's
you.
the
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
the smarter way to do it. And
Yeah.
I think in the US, people have started to pick up on that in the bait finesse
Well,
world.
I'll tell you, we are all in on that in the Mastering Rod Building podcast because the guy who sort of introduced this concept is a gentleman named Rich Forehand, who's a retired fighter jet pilot and wrote a book called Power Hand Bait Casting, where he literally, and he's a huge deal. He's the one who invented the split grip. He's the one who invented no foregrip on these rods. Like he's done so many things for how we modern, even the Japanese
Hmm.
modernly build what we consider super high performance rods. But he's been a guest of the podcast and gone through that. And he went so far as to sit in the boat with back then it was Bassmaster that we didn't have the Elite series, and stopwatch people and
Yeah,
count how many casts they got a day versus people who were switching hands. And he's like mathed that out. And so yeah, that got me to switch when I was in my 20s.
good,
And
good.
it's
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
and it's so funny because I took all left-handed reels in the boat with me on this trip to Arkansas, and one of my guides was like, "Oh man, you got your backwards reels, you know." And then he fished it, and he was like, "Well, this isn't too bad, man. You
It
could get
takes a
used to
little bit
this."
of getting used to, but you know
Right,
what? Every guy right now that's listening to this and shaking their head saying, "Oh, I'll never do that. I can't do that. It doesn't make
right.
sense to me." You're already doing it with a spinning reel, man.
Yeah,
You're
exactly. So
already
just give it a try.
This
It's not
is
as
much
yeah, right,
closer to how you work those
right,
bait. You know what I mean? You're
right.
you're taking those same spinning reel baits. You want it on the left. You want that. And if you don't want to switch on your heavy stuff because you
Yeah,
think you're gonna hook set better or whatever, that's
fine.
fine.
Don't.
Do whatever you want. I don't care. Do whatever you want. But if you're getting this equipment because you want to be more efficient, because this is what that equipment does is create more efficiency in your
Yeah,
fishing, then don't negate probably the
the biggest
simplest thing
efficiency.
you could do to increase your efficiency, which is
Right.
not have
Yeah.
to juggle your rod,
Yeah.
especially if you're using this to make short, pinpoint, accurate
Right.
casts. And these fish might take it like
Immediately.
instantly.
Right.
And
Yeah.
if you're overhand casting a medium heavy rod, that lure has air time. You got
Right.
time to switch.
Right. Not
You're
necessarily this
underhand
size.
and sidearm and casting low, fast trajectory to
Right.
maybe only 5, 6 yards away sometimes with these. You don't have time to switch before it's in the water.
Yeah.
And you want that instant control
In
of
the
being able
action. Yeah.
to turn the handle, your reel is engaged, you're ready to set the hook instantly,
Yeah.
like before it's in the water. You know what
And
I
one of
mean?
the only arguments against making this switch back in the day was there was such a limited
Oh
availability of
yeah,
left-hand reels. But with BFS reels, I have not yet seen a single BFS model that isn't offered in both right and left. So,
correct. And
so it's
and
not an issue. Yeah.
and I do, yeah, and I do want to say, I, I think people get that, right? You say you already do it, so I'm preaching to the choir, but I do sell a lot more left-hand reels
Yeah.
in bait finesse. And maybe it's my particular audience. Maybe I get the more nerdy bait finesse guys versus some other places, but I think people realize that and it's catching on. And I would encourage people to take it to their other styles of fishing too, but at least within the realm of bait finesse, it really is worth taking the time and energy to learn
I'll
to
make this
use your
commitment
other
to my
hand.
listeners right now. You go buy any reel Amir sells left-handed, and if you don't like it, I'll pay you half what you paid for it
There you
and
go.
take it off your hands.
There you go.
What
Yeah,
was the other thing,
it's worth
Amir?
it. Oh yeah. So the other thing I wanted to say was, and it reminded me because it was this particular reel, this Daiwa reel that I had seen a video of it. We were talking about rod blanks, right? And
Hmm.
what we use these rods for. And the idea is, and we were saying like the reel is the most important part because it is what lets you actually accomplish the casting of these light lures
Hmm.
more than the other pieces. It's the most important part. Yes, it's a system; they all work together, but the reel is the most important part. And to kind of show that is another rod formula I've seen, right? And in Japan, in the US, I've seen the term thrown around a lot of power finesse or power bait finesse.
Hmm.
And people tend to think, oh, if you're throwing a quarter ounce, that's power bait finesse. Whatever, that's just a term kind of the internet's made up. But in Japan, there is a real thing called PE bait finesse. PE stands for polyethylene, which is what braided line is made out of, right?
Hmm.
PE bait finesse. And now PE bait finesse means using bait finesse with heavier braids. When I say heavier, I'm talking 1.5 to 2 go, which is
Hmm.
the diameter system they use in Japan. And
Right.
what that equates to is a true 25 to 30 pound braid.
Hmm.
Now, all of a sudden, you're going, why would you use 25 to 30 pound braid in a bait finesse situation? Well, because 25 to 30 pound braid is about as thick as a 6 pound fluoro,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So you can use if you could do it with a 6 pound fluoro, you could do it with a 30 pound braid. Now all of a sudden you can with these reels, you can cast a 1/8 ounce lure, all in 1/8 ounce on 30 pound braid, and you could do it on a medium heavy rod with one of those super soft solid carbon tips,
Hmm.
and you can pull bass out of nasty muck using lures that are much too light to do with your flipping stick.
Interesting. That's
That
fascinating.
is a technique that is definitely a thing in Japan, right? And it's funny
Interesting.
because I hear people here always saying, "Oh, American BFS is it's American BFS, it's way heavier." It's not true, man. Over there, they're serious about pulling bass out of big stuff, and they use
Yeah.
heavy lines. And so I've seen bait finesse reels, real deal bait finesse reels on medium heavy rods that use those super soft, solid carbon tips. So it's like you have a medium heavy backbone and you have an ultralight tip on a rod, right? Um,
That's
and
fascinating.
that pairs to be able to do short, pinpoint accurate casting with downsized lures and still set. It might only be a size one hook, but you're pulling it out of gunk and you're using thick gauge wire stuff and you're doing it with 25 to 30 pound braid. Now that absolutely is a thing that is done over in Japan, right? So that
That's
just shows you the
absolutely
possibility
fascinating.
and the pay finesse is so unlimited in a
Yeah,
way,
it suggests that
right?
we're just getting started with this and
It
it'll
really is. We
continue to
really are just
evolve
getting
and that these
started.
principles may be applicable in other places, right? Yeah.
Absolutely, right? Because the reel gives you the ability to cast the light lure. That doesn't mean you have to cast the lightest lure and you have to cast it in open water, right? There's ways you can
Right.
play with other parts of those formulas and to make things possible that were not possible before, if that makes
Oh
sense.
man, now you
And that
gave
goes
me new
into
research to do. You just
yeah,
cost
that
me
goes
money
into
again.
sorry, brother. But that goes into rod lengths too with the we didn't talk about but rod pieces, right? Like
Hmm.
a blank pieces.
Yep.
You don't have to use one piece blanks. And in fact, the majority of the rods I use are multi-piece,
Yep.
right? And that actually gives you as a rod builder or the companies that build a lot of these rods, the ability to use two different blanks to make a blank, right?
Right.
And what
Right.
I mean by that is there are literally rods out there that are two-piece, three-piece, five-piece, whatever, that will
And they're
use,
not all the same composition in
they
terms
are
of
not the
tubular
same
carbon,
composition
solid
from
carbon,
piece to
glass,
piece.
whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. You might have
Yeah.
a butt section that's half glass and half graphite.
Yep.
They'll throw a spigot ferrule right there in the middle, and then you
Hmm.
have a full carbon tip, a solid carbon tip,
Yep.
or a standard graphite tip, or what you know what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've seen rods. I believe Mega Bass does one.
Yes,
It's a
they do.
three-piece rod that has multiple tip options,
Yep.
right? You have a butt and a middle, right? Your butt and
Right.
your belly, right?
Right.
That are set. And then it comes with two different tips. You could use this tip or that tip. So don't be scared to if you're a rod builder and a blank, especially if you're good with blanks, don't be scared to Frankenstein some blanks together.
Yeah. Seriously.
And they do that a lot in Japan. They do that a lot. And there's nothing, in my opinion, in 2024, there's absolutely nothing stopping a multi-piece rod from being just as good, just as sensitive as a single piece
No,
rod.
they're not.
This
It's
is
just you
not the
have to have
1980s
somebody who knows what
anymore.
they're doing, putting them together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Use a
That's
spigot
it.
ferrule design like they've been
Yep.
doing on fly rods for a century,
Yeah.
and give yourself plenty of extra carbon in that spigot so you have a nice tight fit
Yeah.
and play around with it. There are
Yeah.
rods. out there from factory that are labeled light, medium, light,
Yeah.
or
It's
ultra
so
light, medium, light, or
it's
whatever,
so
and they
interesting
mix
you
and
brought
match
this
blade
up.
caps.
Yeah, there's a guy, there's a small boutique custom shop in Michigan. And there's a guy named Shane Gray, and
I
he
know
runs
Shane.
Gray Wolf
Yeah.
rods.
I
You know
started
Shane?
carrying a garage just recently,
Oh
honestly.
man, yeah.
They're,
So
they're cool. They're good.
he's like exactly who I think of when you bring that up because I was fishing some of his blanks, some three-piece carbon blanks, also some fiberglass blanks, and then he's got some. I can't talk about everything he's working on right now, but he's playing in this space you're talking about, not only with multi-modulus things and different pieces made of different things, but also different, fundamentally different construction techniques than a traditional tubular carbon or fiberglass
Hmm.
blank. And I'm super impressed. I mean, it's very sort of Renaissance artisanal kind of like cool small batch stuff. But it's a very high quality product and it's exactly as you described it. And so it's, I'm just really, I get excited when I know somebody really capable like that is out there playing around with this stuff, you know,
Yeah.
because I know I'm already really happy with what I've gotten from him. And I'm delighted to hear you're carrying the rods. Great stuff.
Hmm.
And then it's going to be interesting to see what he does next because
I
he's
think
got
he's.
some really interesting stuff in the works, which I will not out. But I'm wanting him to, I'm wanting to have him on the podcast to talk about it once he
Oh,
releases it
I would
because I
love to
think it's
watch
gonna.
that.
No,
Yeah,
yeah,
he's
yeah.
been he's been. I'm not a fly guy, but I know he's had reputation in the fly world for a
Oh
long
yeah, him.
time,
He's
especially
got
out in the
the work with
Midwest,
Stephen Brothers and everything.
Northwest,
Yeah, they have a cult
or North
following.
Midwest.
Yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah.
where you guys are at. But he really, I know he got into Bait Finesse a few years ago, and he's done a
Yep.
lot of cool stuff. And we recently just started carrying his newest series, which is called the Brook series, and those are like
Love
a
it.
good multi-species,
Yep,
a
they are.
budget rod, right? He comes
Right.
in under $100, which is awesome. And
It's a
hopefully,
lot of
make sure we
rod for the
carry.
money. Yeah,
Yeah, oh, it absolutely is. He does great work, and he backs it up. Being an American brand, he backs it up with a good warranty. And you can
100%.
reach out to him or myself, obviously, for any support you need on his products, which is awesome.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Um,
Man,
yeah,
Amir, this has been so unbelievably helpful. I know you probably feel a little henpecked because not we do one episode and I'm immediately like, hey, can we do another one? And
no, I was
I'll give you a little
happy.
space. I'll give you some oxygen. I'll let you breathe before we do the next one. But this is just absolutely fascinating stuff. And again, there's lots of places you can get this stuff, but I think the value of going to a place like a Bait Finesse Empire, right, or a BFS Trout Lures or a Hookup Tackle, they have people who do this. Like Amir's been doing this. This is what he does. He's used all the baits he sells. He's used all the lines and hooks. And I was harassing you about I need some replacement hooks. Some of this stuff can be different. Sizing and numbers don't always add up to what you're used to them adding up to. So if you have any questions, you're not sure, you can send Amir an email. You
Yeah,
can watch. There's so much content out there by Hunter Fisher and Roar Fishing and Amir with Bait Finesse Empire. Check out all the content on YouTube and other platforms. And hopefully, part of what we've done is kind of demystify this and just open your eyes to it. And I cannot say enough. Now I've had my eyes open fishing a fishery I fish almost daily off my dock in Orange Beach. And as soon as I went with BFS, it opened up a whole new fishery and number of bites to me. Now I've gone to fish a fishery that I know and I've fished my whole life, probably know as well as anywhere. I really consider my home waters and had just shocking results. Even in a place I'd say is a great fishery, and I know we're going to catch fish, and I know how to catch fish lots of ways there. The BFS was blew me away, blew our professional guides away who have decades on that river. I just can't say enough about how fun and how effective this technique is. So if you have any questions, if you're thinking about it, if you just want to buy a finished rod and try it for a while, or you're so excited you can't wait to build a rod and put it together, um, Amir's got all this stuff at Bait Finesse Empire. He's happy to help and steer you and it's I just can't say enough about it. I've experienced him as a customer first and now as sort of a podcast guest and I hope a friend, and I just really appreciate your time, Amir, and y'all do great work, and I
thank
appreciate
you.
all the content and everything you do, and thanks again so much for coming on the Mastering Rod Building podcast.
Very happy to be here. Thanks for having me, and hopefully, yeah, our listeners picked up a few things today.
I'm sure they did, and I'm sure you're going to hear from some of them. And again, I never know exactly when we're recording this when it's going to, go through production and get sent out. But Amir runs a bunch of promotions. There's a great Black Friday sale going on right now. And would highly encourage you. He's got free USA shipping on orders over 100. So check it out. It makes it so easy in a one-stop shop to get everything you need to just get a setup put together and go try this stuff. And I know exactly what's going to happen once you do. You're coming back for more. So
I
Amir,
always
thanks
do.
so
Yeah.
much. Yeah, and we'll. I want to extend the invitation that anytime if you find yourself in the northern Gulf of Mexico or the Gulf Coast, come see me. We'll go saltwater BFS,
Would
dude.
love to. Oh,
I've
that'd be
got
so
some
fun.
spots working. It's fun.
That's awesome.
Just
Thank
bring a
you.
net because we're not swinging any of these fish over the
I
gunnel
hear
of the
you.
center
Absolutely.
console in
Always
saltwater. I
having that.
promise. Yeah,
Always
yeah.
having that. Yep.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody so much for tuning in. Please remember to like and subscribe and download wherever you get your podcast content. We'll see you next time.
Thanks.
See you. Thanks, Amir.